Hey there guys, I am the Sixth Machine and welcome back to another Warhammer video. We are back with another unit review, this time heading back to the green tide that is the Orks, but this review is going to be for a non-Ork unit, and a unit which was back in 8th edition considered to be one of the best units in the entire codex I think, and yes, today we are going to be taking a look at the Ork Mek Gunz. And as usual, we will be looking at their stats, their abilities, the price of them, and any potential stratagems or abilities that they can make use of, before hopefully coming to a conclusion about whether they are worth bringing in 9th edition. So the Mek Gunz now come in at a nice flat 45 points each, which is a welcome change in my opinion from the varying prices that they had previously, and although it does mean that a couple have gone up in points, it definitely does help to just simplify their datasheet and also in theory allow Games Workshop to try and balance them all around the same level of strength without one being the absolute go-to option for damage output and price. Although of course whether they were actually successful in that we will have to wait and see, but in theory I think bringing them all to the same base price is a nice step. And for that 45 points you get a bit of a mixed bag in terms of their profile. They have a unit size of 1 to 3, movement 3 inches, weapon skill 5 up, ballistic skill 4 plus, strength 2, but a pretty decent toughness of 5, 6 wounds, 6 attacks, an extremely awful leadership of 4, and then a 5 up save. So there are some saving graces in this profile. Toughness 5, 6 wounds, and a minimum size of 1 does let you pretty cheaply bring a few of these to, fill up your heavy support slots in your list if you need some more firepower, and it does give you some very welcome 4 up ballistic skill firepower as well. So they are slightly better at shooting than your regular Ork units, and then with that defensive profile, for 45 points it's actually not too bad. You need about, on average, 35 bolt rifle shots to get rid of one of these, so they can still take a little bit of a beating if they do need to. Of course, counter to that, there are some abysmal downsides as well, notably the leadership of 4, which means that if you are taking more than one of these guys, it's incredibly dangerous. In a squad of 3, if you lose 1 from enemy fire, you are automatically losing another on the roll of a 4 plus in your morale test, and then you will of course be under half strength if you do lose another one, so the subsequent combat attrition test will be failed on 1s and 2s as well. So it is incredibly possible to lose an entire squad of 3 of these to morale just by losing a single model in the shooting or the fight phase. And with that in mind, I would say that these units, the Mek Gunz, are definitely only worth bringing, if you want to bring them, in squads of 1. But what about their specific abilities? Do any of those help at all? Well, they have a couple which are pretty much in my opinion just housekeeping rules. Artillery and crew means that the gun and its crew are treated as a single model, so the crew can't be shot, and it also cannot advance and charge, which I mean is a downside I guess, but if you are ever wanting to advance or charge a mech gun, you're probably in a bad place anyway, so I don't really see that as too much of a detriment. They do also have the Warg rule as well, which again I think is mainly just for housekeeping. They don't have the HQ or the core keywords, so they can't advance and charge, not that they can advance or charge anyway. They do have the Ork faction keyword, so I think they get that +1 attack in a regular Warg in case they do end up getting locked up in combat, so you will have 7 strength 2 no AP attacks instead of 6, which I mean, it's something, I suppose. And then if you are with a speed boss, so you have the speed Warg variant, they get no benefit from that at all. They are not Ork vehicles or Ork bikers. So the Warg rule is something that you will honestly likely forget that you have, because it brings 99% of the time no benefit to them whatsoever. But if you do remember it, it's 1 extra strength 2 attack, so yay, I guess. One rule that they have that is actually a big help to them is that they have the new and improved Ramshackle rule, which is genuinely fantastic on toughness 5 models, and means that the mid-strength damage 2 attacks of things like heavy bolters and autocannons and that sort of thing, which is the ideal weaponry to go into toughness 5 multi-wound targets, is massively less effective against your mech guns, and it will essentially halve the incoming damage from things like heavy bolters, which is huge. So this is a really good little buff for them, and will mean that your opponent will either have to expend a lot more shots from that kind of weaponry to get rid of your mech guns, or alternatively dedicate some much heavier strength 8 and above weapons to take them out instead, which is really another win for you, because if your opponent is shooting things like las cannons and melter at your mech guns, then arguably your other more important vehicles will be left to shoot and charge and get up in your enemy's face whilst they are busy destroying your mech guns. And that is actually all the special rules that the mech guns themselves have. They also, having the Gretchen keyword, crucially don't get clan cultures, so that is another important thing to note. You can't be rocking better armor saves with the blood axes if you're over 18 inches away, or get exploding sixes in combat with the Goths, for instance. What is worth mentioning is that, at least until it's FAQ'd, they do have the clan keyword, so although they don't get the trait, they do still technically meet the requirements to fulfill certain conditions in specific traits. For example, the Freebooters trait, which just specifies that when a clan unit destroys an enemy unit, the rest of your army gets that +1 to hit. So you can absolutely use the mech guns to fire into your enemy and kill off a weak or injured unit to get the competitive streak trait activated for the rest of your Freebooters units. And in terms of the damage output of the mech guns themselves, they come with 4 separate options, each being 0 points now instead of the different points that they were before. And as I said, some have changed quite a bit, others not so much. But let's dive into it and see which of the 4 weapon options you can now bring with your mech guns. The first up is the Bubble Chucker, which has now moved from the hilariously random profile of D6 strength, D6 AP and D6 damage to a much simpler, slightly more reliable roll of a D3 to see what profile you use, and you can see it on your screen now. Notably, however, this is done after you select your target, which really does kind of suck and means that you can't see what profile you get and then choose the most appropriate thing to shoot at. So if you are aiming at the big tank and you roll the heavy one shot, then that's great. But if you roll the 3d3 strength 6 profile instead, it's going to really suck for you. And it would honestly make the gun 100% more usable if it just had that small change. And it's one of the cases where randomness for the sake of randomness is detrimental to the game, in my opinion, rather than beneficial. I mean, I get it, it's an Ork unit, it's meant to be crazy and zany and quirky, but things like obliterators and other random profile weapons and guns quite often get to choose their target before they roll, and it does just seem a little bit harsh on the Orks that they can't do that, and it definitely makes this option pretty much a non-starter right from the get-go. The next option you have is the essentially Ork version of the plasma cannon, which is the custom mega cannon, and this one has actually stayed identical to its previous version, being a 36-inch range, heavy d6, strength 8, -3 AP, d6 damage gun, which does a mortal wound if you roll a 1 on 1 or more of your hit rolls. And I mean, for 45 points, it's okay. It's pretty much the same as a Redempted Dreadnought's plasma gun, but with d6 damage instead of the flat 2 or 3. So it definitely has a higher damage ceiling, but obviously also has the downside of being very dependent on that damage roll dice, which is sometimes incredibly frustrating, and I know lots of people would much prefer to have a flat damage dice, even if it's lower than the maximum of the d6, just for the sake of reliability. The previously incredibly powerful Smasha Gun and pretty much go-to option for mech guns in 8th edition has undergone some really significant changes, moving from the hilariously strong heavy d3, -4 AP, d6 damage profile that wounded by rolling 2d6 and trying to equal or beat your target's toughness, so with an average of 7 on 2d6, gave you a pretty great chance of wounding anything from like a rhino or a predator downwards, and had a really solid amount of damage for its very cheap price. And obviously this does make it arguably a bit better at dealing with those heavier toughness 8 targets, but I think in a lot of other situations the 2d6 rolls ended up being just a little bit better than the move to a flat strength value of 8. It's still a very good shout and has some advantages over things like the Mega Cannon in that it doesn't hurt you on an unmodified hit roll of a 1, but again it has the obvious downside of only having a maximum of 3 shots compared to the maximum of 6 from the Mega Cannon. So I think that either of these are pretty decent choices overall. It just depends on your personal playstyle and whether you want to risk the d6 dice roll over the d3, and also don't mind taking the odd mortal wound when you roll a 1. The final option is another that I thought was absolutely amazing back in 8th edition and which has also been somewhat toned down, making the move into 9th in some ways, and that is the Tractor Cannon. This was previously a heavy 1, strength 8, minus 2 AP, d6 damage shot, which automatically hit, which is obviously brilliant for an army like Orks with their poor ballistic skill, and against a vehicle that could fly, you rolled 2d6 and took the highest for damage, so it really helped with those 1 or 2 damage rolls that you occasionally roll. And then on top of that as well, it also caused vehicles that could fly to, if they were destroyed, automatically crash and burn, so you could potentially do even more wounds to your opponent as it exploded around their battle lines. Once again, this has been neutered in some ways, although somewhat buffed in others, and now has a much nicer strength 8 minus 2 d3 plus 3 damage profile, which is much nicer than even the 2d6 take the highest that it had before, and on top of that, against vehicles that can fly, it actually goes up to d6 plus 3, so a potential for 9 damage against enemy flying vehicles. The downside it's taken, however, is that it no longer automatically hits. Instead, you add +1 to hit against non-aircraft units and +2 to hit against aircraft units. So you will still be hitting most things on 3s with this gun, which isn't terrible by any means, and for an Ork that is really good ballistic skill, but it is obviously massively worse than automatically hitting. I think overall the changes are largely positive ones across these guns. They lose a bit of their quirkiness and their fluff and their fun, admittedly, but they do overall tend to have a bit more of a stable, reliable damage output thanks to the changes that have been made going into 9th edition, and they can still do a decent chunk of damage to enemy tanks and heavy armor over the course of the game, which is pretty much what mech guns are meant to do. But in terms of which I think is best and whether they are actually worth taking, well, if you know enemy flyers are going to be present, I still think the Tractor Cannon is a fantastic choice for that potential 9 damage, but in a more general kind of take all comers list, I would 100% steer towards something like the Mega Cannon or the Smasha Gun. Which of those is better is largely up to you, and whether you want the potential for d6 shots but run the risk of mortal wounds, or have the safer but lower maximum of the Smasha Gun. In general though, overall, are they worth it? Well, just a quick bit of math hammer against something like a Space Marine Predator. The Mega Cannon will do on average 3.4 damage in a single shooting phase, whilst the Smasha Gun does about 2.3 damage, and the Tractor Cannon will do about 1.8. So they're not exactly one-shotting enemy armor, and that is honestly a tiny amount of damage from even a 45-point model, which is taking up one of your heavy support slots. And like we said, yes, you can bring them in squads of 3, which would massively improve their performance, but then again, you run the risk of losing all 3 of these guys just by losing one model in the enemy shooting phase, thanks to their abysmal leadership. They suffer as well from having no stratagems or other auras or buffs or abilities to make them any better or improve their ability to do damage, and I think that really does cause them to struggle. It's just very, very hard to leverage them in big enough quantities to really make use of them without risking them all running away as soon as your opponent starts shooting them. I would say bringing them in full squads of 3 or even in squads of 2 is pretty much dead in the water, but they aren't a total waste in a single unit. And if you are running a dual detachment, which most Ork players are doing at the moment, you may well have a spare heavy support slot or 2, and if you end up with 50 or 100 spare points that you can't quite decide what to do with, maybe bringing a couple of mech guns just to plink off the final few wounds from an enemy tank may not be the worst way to spend those points. They do have a genuinely high level of potential threat damage, and I think a lot of people are scared when they see that this 45-point model, you know, like a mega cannon, can do 36 damage in a single shooting phase in theory. So there are definite threats to be had from this gun, even if it is 90% of the time unlikely to actually get anywhere near that. I think a lot of players are rightly concerned about the potential damage they can do. So in some ways, they are almost good as a nice, cheap distraction Carnifex style unit. And that is honestly how I would use them. Just put them down in your deployment zone with a good firing lane and almost dare your opponent to ignore them and run the risk of taking some huge damage from them, you know, with a bit of lucky dice rolling on your part, or force your opponent to dedicate some firepower to get rid of what is a surprisingly durable, relatively cheap, almost throwaway model that you don't really care if you lose, as long as it helps the rest of your army get up nice and close to your opponent's battle lines. But what do you think of the Mek Guns? Do you use them in 9th edition, and if so, which gun do you tend to bring? Do you think they are better or worse than they were in 8th edition? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe for more Warhammer content from me, but until next time, I'll catch you later, guys.